Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Amira's Champion Every Voice podcast, where we elevate the voices of educators and thought leaders who are creating meaningful experiences for students every day. I'm super excited about our conversation today because we're going to be talking about literacy at scale and the amazing impact of leadership in one of the nation's most diverse school districts. We're also going to be looking at how policy actually shows up in teaching and learning in classrooms and what it truly takes to support students and educators in powerful ways. I am joined today by Dr. David Cintron, Superintendent of District 14 in Brooklyn, New York. David, thank you so much for being here. And as I always say, let's get this reading party started.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Awesome. And thank you so much for joining us from such an amazing school district. We'd like to know more about your leadership journey, Dr. Cintron. If you don't mind, just share us about your background in education and what kind of led you to your superintendency in your current role.
Thank you for that. I think my journey towards the superintendency really began with my first stepping foot into a school building. I'm a proud product of the New York City public school system. I grew up in the South Bronx, and from the first day of school, where my mom dropped me off for kindergarten, I began emulating my teachers and just developed that thirst and passion for teaching and learning so early on that carried over with me throughout my entire journey to now celebrating my 25th year in the public school system. I've served at every level of the teaching trajectory, from classroom teacher, instructional coach, assistant principal. I spent some time mentoring new principals and ultimately landed here in Brooklyn as the superintendent of District 14.
So you've lived the experiences of the team that you now are leading, and you've done it in the same community. That's just really exceptional. And I'm so happy that you shared the journey that you've had over these last 25 years. I think, Dr. Cintron, I think we began together. We're right at that 25-year mark together. And from the moment I met you, when I came to one of your community school meetings, a couple of community meetings with parents about a year or so ago, I could feel the passion in the way that you spoke, especially concerning your students and your families. And so, again, we just thank you for joining us today and for allowing our listeners to hear and learn more about you. Let's talk about literacy at scale in District 14. When you think about literacy improvement across a school district as complex as yours, what does getting it right actually mean? And what does it require from leadership as you're thinking about literacy in your district?
That is such an interesting question. That the notion of getting it right. First of all, thank you for joining us in District 14 and spending time with us in our community engagement session. So you got to experience it in real time, the work that we are constantly doing towards that mission of getting it right. I think the first thing to note is that getting it right requires an understanding that getting it right is not a destination. It's a pursuit that we're on over time that's relentlessly taking us down the journey toward the goals, achieving the goals that we've established for ourselves and for our school district. And part of getting it right is also getting it really clear about what it is that we're trying to do. And I think there are three areas that we focus on as a district in terms of getting it right, particularly as it relates to literacy instruction and literacy learning, to ensure that we accelerate the learning for all learners, is that we build out a very clear and coherent model for the work that we do in the areas of curriculum, instruction, and assessment. It also requires that we are very vociferous and very transparent, as you got to experience during our community meeting, about the work that's underway, why we're doing the work that we're doing, and how we're ensuring that everybody's on board. It isn't a some come on board and some don't. It's an all or nothing endeavor to ensure that we encapsulate the learning and the successful trajectory for all students in our district.
I love that. I love that you began with the development of shared meaning on what is it that we're doing. and why is it important and what is about to come. And you also mentioned, I thought you were going to say that it is a process, but you used a very specific word. You said it is about the pursuit. And I love that you use that word, Dr. Cintron, because a process, it signifies that there's an end to it. But a pursuit allows you to be relentless and it allows you to have flexibility in your approach. And I've actually witnessed that from visiting your district. So, again, thank you for elevating the need to have that shared meaning foundationally across the board in those specific areas. Thinking about that shared meaning and making sure that you're inclusive in your approach and the stakeholders that you're involving. What have you learned about building a culture where principals and teachers, your staff, parents, and even your students feel aligned and supported and accountable to the work that you guys are establishing?
Great question. That whole notion of the pursuit in the work that we're doing is, as I mentioned before, an all or nothing endeavor. Everybody's got to be on board. So repetition of messaging is critical. We have to ensure that everybody knows explicitly what we're working on, why we're working on it, and the benchmarks along the way that are going to tell us that we're achieving the ends that we're setting out to achieve. But a very key aspect in building out that culture, as you've described, is really about engaging in the very often messy work of shared decision making, ensuring that everyone has a seat at the table and is a contributing member of our community, whether an educator, non-educator, parent, student, is vitally important to ensure that the entire organization is moving in the same direction. And I call that messiness, the work of shared decision making, messy because it requires that we slow our processes down. It requires that we think more deeply and we engage more deeply so that we can ensure that there is a true norming of what it is we're trying to do at scale, so that as we get the burners firing off, we get folks moving together in a symbiotic way. The other piece to that, though, is focusing on what I mentioned earlier, that instructional coherence. It's got to be an all or nothing endeavor. And that shared decision-making process requires that we name the work and the practices that are required in order to achieve that work. So in combining the two, then we ensure that our transparency in the process and our transparency in the intended outcomes are also linked to outcomes. And so that we as a collective can measure our progress, we can ensure that we can engage in the progress monitoring that's necessary in all spaces throughout our community to be able to say, like, we are hitting the mark or we aren't hitting the mark. And if we're not, to make the changes together that need to be made in order to steer the ship in the right direction, if you will. And then I end with what I begin with, the repetition of messages. That messaging has to be clear. It has to be invoked in any space where we're engaging with all stakeholders, rather, to ensure that it sticks and that the message, because through its repetition, then gets internalized and can be held by all, and not just building out compliance for the work, but the commitment that we need in order to achieve lasting and sustainable results for children.
And commitment, you cannot get commitment from people. We can have the best laid out plans, Dr. Cintron, but we can't get commitment for people if our heart as the leader isn't showing up in the work. And I think it is so important that the leaders have a great understanding of whatever the goals are that are being established. And like you said, beyond having just a shared meaning of what is this process, what are we pursuing, what are the actual goals, and over communicating that in some points. Let's talk about policy to practice and coherence. You mentioned coherence earlier. So, in a system as large and as diverse as yours in New York, where do you most often see opportunities for more alignment and coherence between where policies or the intent for a policy actually connects with what you need to see in classrooms?
In the last couple of years in New York City has really been great examples of how policy and practice meet, and that nexus becomes really the something special for us to accomplish as school leaders and as a field of education in general. NYC Reads is such an initiative that, as New York City, has been the hallmark work that we're doing around this, ensuring that our classrooms are aligned with the science of reading, that we implement high quality curriculum and coherent instructional practices. We've known for some time nationwide that we've had a crisis in literacy, and it had to be addressed. And our city took the bold move and decision to move it, to get all of the, if you will, all the players on the bus, whether it's families, it's our elected officials, it's our funders, etc., all coming together around that one mandate to ensure that every student can read. We
Yes.
know that this is the civil rights issue of our time. And so this policy that was needed to come to what we know is evidence-based teaching and learning and instruction practices that will yield improved outcomes for students actually began driving the reform work in our schools and in our classrooms. And you get to see that every day in my district, for example, in this work that I mentioned earlier of coherence around instruction around the district. So we, for example, we've designed an instructional program that is driven by the science of reading, that it aims to ensure that all the components of sound literacy instruction that we know is all evidence-based is incorporated into the day in a very practical, programmatically sound way for teachers to have the ability to be able to teach. Our professional development, our support from the district office and from the central office, our messaging across the city has all been consistent around the work we do with ensuring that kids have an opportunity to become proficient readers very early on through NYC Reads. And one of the other hallmarks of that work is that we have a coherent curriculum, which is New York City historically hasn't been the case. It's been more of a design your own, or some playbooks, as our prior chancellor used to say, that were not necessarily the right ones as it pertains to the science of reading. But in a short period of time, we've been able to coalesce around this policy for literacy instruction and to begin aligning our resources, our systems for school improvement, our supports, and all the resources that are needed align with that vision for literacy instruction. It's an exciting time in New York City, and it's just getting started. We're only a couple of years into the work. I'm confident that we see this work through, which we're doing every day. It's going to have the lasting impact on student outcomes and in literacy for decades and generations to come.
I can't imagine the impact that's having on your teachers in them being able to see the alignment, the connection between their professional development and the actual resources they have to use and what students are doing, and the operational and curriculum calendars that you guys have established. I can imagine that is quite helpful in settling to them, because teaching is such a difficult, it's a difficult job, but it would make it so much easier for districts like yours and others to have a coherent model where the coherence is not just coherence amongst the materials and resources we're using, but also the systems and structures and the departments that have to talk to make this work become coherent for the people using it. Thank you for sharing how you guys are going about that. And it's not just about products and software and textbooks, it's about being coherent in everything, your conversations and your teams. Let's talk about how community and parent engagement is I guess impacted by you beginning to utilize AI in your district. So, how do you think parent and community engagement impacts the successful adoption and implementation of innovating program like an AI learning agent? How did you initially approach your parents and community discussions about the responsible use of AI in your schools?
Great question. There are a few, I think, very important steps in the process to answer the question about the community engagement successfully impacting the adoption and implementations. Like any new innovation, any innovation in teaching and learning, it comes back to what I said earlier around shared decision making and transparency. And so whether it's a new textbook series, a new curriculum, certainly innovative technologies like artificial intelligence, same approach we would take. And there are a couple of things that have to happen, such as the transparency in the work that we're doing, the alignment to the goals that we have as a district and for our students, that has to be self-evident. It shouldn't be an adoption of a new curriculum or new technology for the sake of adoption, but really because it adds value to the work that's occurring across our district. I'll give you an example in the literacy frame. We talked a little bit about NYC Reads and the work that we're doing. And when it comes to community and family engagement, it was a no-brainer to us in District 14 that we design our family workshops, our family engagement series around the work that we're doing with literacy. So the work that we're, for example, leading in professional development around the science of reading, the foundational literacy skills, innovative technologies to augment that work. We're also replicating with our parents and providing them with training, exposure, and opportunities to experience firsthand the work that we're doing, but also to align it. And so, for example, in those family engagement sessions, we're engaging our families with texts and technologies while students are learning them in school. So there's specific foundational literacy skills that they're learning in class. Those workshops then are following that scope and sequence, if you will, to ensure that families, that we wrap our arms around our families to ensure that they have the information, the training, and additional resources that they can use at home that are aligned with what's happening at school. That, for example, would be delivered through some tech sets that we gift to our parents who attend those sessions. We also do the same as it pertains to the technology. Artificial intelligence, for example, is huge. It's permeated every aspect of life, in not just in schools and in education, but in human life. And part of that work for us, I think the fundamental difference for us as it pertains to the newer technologies versus, let's say, foundational literacy skills, is to demystify the fear of the unknown, to help our families understand what the technology is and what it isn't, and how it's intended to support children. So, for example, in using Amira as an intelligent tutoring system, it isn't just as a tool that we've popped into the classroom. It was strategically aligned to the instructional framework that we established as a district, where we've outlined the time and resources for teachers. And it's also been incorporated in a way that it augments the teaching and learning that's happening to amplify the teacher's reach. So to come back to that community engagement, while that's happening in the classroom, families are learning about it during our institutes for families. And we're engaging with families not only around the tool, but the broader learning around the technology that's behind it, so that folks can get a better handle on what it is, and also to be better able to manage it, not just as it relates to our work in schools with our children, but generally in life. I'll give you another example. So we saw the need not only to help our families get their better understand what the technology is. About a year ago, when you and I were together, it became clear to us that we needed to also bring our families into the conversation. We needed to slow the process down and bring our families and our community stakeholders into the space with us to discuss what it is we were doing with technologies and with curriculum, and to what end, and what we weren't doing with it, so that they could help us make better decisions as we expand or shift directions in terms of their use. And so that has helped us slow down, but to also accelerate the work that we're doing as it pertains to a coherent approach to literacy instruction and to innovative technologies. But I cannot emphasize it enough that any innovation, any decision that we make must be grounded in our goals as a district, clearly connected to the policy and the goals that are driven by the policy that we have both at New York City Public Schools and within our district, because that helps us ensure that there's clear alignment between all of the decisions we're making, and again, the intended outcomes we have in the pursuit of the work that we're endeavoring to achieve.
And this parent and community engagement that you have going, it's just another layer of how you're building these coherent practices and pieces and systems in your district. It's not a standalone piece. It is connected to your district's goals. It is connected to what's showing up in classes, and it is also connected to what is showing up in your parent and community engagement. And I want to highlight that you use the word series to describe what you guys are doing. So it's not in haphazard where you guys are just showing up each month with a different meeting. You have your parents and your community engaged in a system of exercises and meetings so that they can learn along with the system that you've established internally. And I just think that's so amazing. It's just not workshops that you're having, it is a series of connected engagements that really help you to drive what's happening in your district. I witnessed that, Dr. Cintron. I witnessed the hot cocoa and snowflakes, and I saw your parents there on a really cold night. And I heard from your students just the amazing things that they have going at their schools. And I think it was a student government election that night during that parent engagement. And so you got your parents out so that they could hear their babies run for student government, but you also had them there to teach them about the amazing literacy pieces and artificial intelligence that you guys are engaging them in the class. And so I saw that authentic work going on in your district, and it never left me. We're going to get to another piece that I saw there a little ways down, some other things that you do as a superintendent. But I want to talk about, before we get to that, the AI and the human centered relationship. You talked about all the roles that you've had in education, and I talked about seeing your heart the moment that I met you. But AI is becoming such a huge part of the conversation that it's so easy for some people to think that it's going to replace humans. Can you talk about how AI can actually strengthen the work that humans are doing in schools and not to replace them, but to strengthen the work?
And there are a couple of, I think, very important mechanisms for doing that. First of all, AI can never, ever replace the human teacher. Teaching is just both an art and a science. And while we may automate certain aspects of work that we do, we can never automate the presence and the decision-making of the human being. The work of integrating artificial intelligence really requires an understanding that it's meant to amplify the work of the teacher or the leader or the student even. The idea is to augment in a way that we can meet the needs of diverse learners and amplify teaching in ways that traditional human teaching cannot. But I think it's twofold. On the one hand, we see very clearly that AI presents the opportunity for us to augment leadership, to augment teaching, and to augment learning in very meaningful ways. As long as we follow some of those steps that we described earlier in terms of innovation, alignment, and the coherence, I think we have opportunities here to really amplify the work. We still need the teacher to be able to manage and oversee the entire teaching and learning process. Thus, the teacher can never be automated, if you will. That's the art of it, right? But there are certain aspects of teaching, for example, that can be automated by the use of AI. For example, in planning, curriculum organization, diagnostic assessment analysis, right? There's so many things that can be laborious in nature for teachers that we should take advantage of the use of AI in order to amplify their work, to free up the time for the teacher to be able to do the other aspects of teaching and learning that matter the most, the face-to-face interactions with children, right? That
Right, the heart of it,
they're
getting
absolutely
back to the
part of it.
heart of it.
And to also engage with kids around the soft skills, not just the academic skills of developing their own social emotional intelligence, their critical thinking, their collaborative problem solving skills, and their discourse. I mean, these are areas of teaching that really prepare students for a successful life and productivity in the workforce of the future. And the same can be said about augmenting leadership. We have systems we can use so that leaders' time can also be freed up for them to do the work of leading and supporting teachers and students in ways that no technology cannot do on its own. And obviously for students, to augment the learning experience for students through agentic learning that's done in a safe and responsible way that will help us amplify the teacher's impact. Because after all, it's the teacher who's controlling the technology, managing it, and ensuring that it's focused on the things that student needs in real time, and ultimately to be taken home, because the technology is not limited to the four walls of the school. But the other side of it is the literacy, the AI literacy that's needed to ensure that humans remain in the loop, that humans remain the decision makers for what the technology is doing. And the only way we can accomplish that is by baking the AI literacy into the educational experience for students and professional development for teachers, because that technology will continue to evolve at such a rapid pace that no textbook series or syllabus is going to be able to keep up with it. We'll just have to iterate and reiterate with the technology our own learning so that we on a back end can keep the control of that technology, because we know its inherent biases and ethical considerations can't be ignored.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Dr. Cintron, you actually touched on another episode that we have on the podcast where we spoke to Dr. Christopher Blair. He's a retired superintendent and thought leader, and his episode was entirely about how AI can impact leadership practices today. I hope that you might have a chance to check out a little bit of that episode because it touches on exactly what you were talking about, how AI is not just to transform how we consider some of those monotonous or tasks that teachers have to do, like planning, but it also can be used to build that capacity in leaders. So thank you for bringing that up. And speaking of leaders and leadership, I want to talk about student centered leadership for a moment with you, Dr. Cintron. When I met you, we had a moment to chat and you showed me your phone cover. And your phone cover, it has a student on it, and I think you probably still do that. So, can you tell us about your phone cover today and what it means to you as a leader? And why do you keep your students on your phone like that? Why do you have them at your forefront each day?
First of all, thank you for remembering. That must have been just a moment in time, and yet over a year later, you remember. At the time, I was just dabbling with learning a new app that is the equivalent of a business card on the electronic device. And I think you got to see the first iteration of it, but that's continued. I still have it, and I do update it from time to time. And I always keep the picture of a student that I take with a student as the design of the business card. And I do that partly to remind myself of why we're here and what we're doing, but also to stay grounded in that every decision I make and everything that I do and every space that I occupy is impacting a child in some way. And truthfully and selfishly, one of the things I miss the most from my principal years and even my teacher days, the day-to-day connections and relationships that I have with children and with families that I don't necessarily get to enjoy as often as a superintendent because of the nature of the bureaucratic nature of the position I hold. However, I make it a point at every school within my district to connect with a child, if not more, and spend time with them at every visit, even if it's just to stop by and say hello, to take a photo, a little selfie that we then put on at the school board just to celebrate our children for various reasons. But I do follow the child over time. And it's gotten to the point now where some of my elementary school babies are now in middle school. And I'm running into them in middle school, and they're experiencing the physiological and psychological changes that middle school brings, and they got all the middle school awkwardness, but it's giving me, filling my heart in that I get to see the impact of the work that we're doing in real time when I'm with them, even if it's just for a brief moment that I visit the school. But the picture also gives me a very grounds level view in maintaining that relationship of how the work is playing out every day in our school. So I get to talk to kids. I think of Xavier, for example, one of my schools who I now have known for about 3 years. And he's about to move into the next grade, obviously, thinking about what the next transition will be for him, but just to see how he's come such a long way in his own learning journey and the ways in which his teacher or teachers, I should say at this point, have developed their practices. Because through my conversations with my students and connecting back to my why, I keep clear track of those milestones in the work that we're doing. And if something gets lost, if my students, my guys at the school, my kids at the school can't articulate to me the thing that's impacting them or that's happening that should have permeated the school, I know I have more work to do.
Mm.
It's all about keeping grounded, maintaining the relationships, because the data is one thing. I have voluminous data, but the story of one student is more powerful and palpable, and the experience of getting to know that student over time is more powerful and palpable than any ream of data or spreadsheet that I'll look at in terms of whether we're achieving our goals or not. So I'll be able to tell stories about Xavier and some of my other students throughout the district who I've gotten to know, who and I'm looking forward to staying in touch with for years to come. Because I often say the fundamental difference between what we do in education versus almost every other industry is that we don't get to see what we've done. The bricklayer lays the foundation, sets the stone in place and builds out that foundation and can step back and say, wow, look at what I've done. We don't often get that opportunity because we don't know where our children go 20, 25 years down the road. But this is in one small way, a method that I use to stay grounded and to pay attention to how that wall is being built over time with bricklayer wood.
Wow. So I knew why you did it, but I didn't know that it went as deep as it did. And I was going to ask you another question, but I don't even think we have to ask the question of what is it that you would advise other leaders to do. I think you just told us, and it's to focus on the children. You said something so profound, Dr. Cintron, when you said that the face of the child, the story of one child, ever look at. I think that's the advice for leaders in the moment. And of course, I want to offer you the opportunity to give more advice, but that is what stuck with me from the moment I met you, that you are student centered and it permeates every aspect of the work that I have witnessed you engage in. So is there anything else that you want to share besides focusing on the children first?
And there's nothing more important in what we do, right, than focusing on the children. I think every educator comes into this with that in mind. We all know whether is the classroom teacher, school leader, district leader, we all have a good sense of why we come into this and who are the most important stakeholders, but we get the busyness of the work could muffle that, I think, at times. And I think the only thing I would add to that, just a couple of points that I would say to leaders, once you're clear about that's your why, right? Don't ever deviate from that. That's the thing that no matter how busy we get, no matter how complex the world becomes or the position that we take, that in which we serve takes us, staying focused on the why will always bring you down the right path, even in those dark moments where it seems like we're alone. I would also say that this is, I said earlier about the messiness of transparency and shared decision making, but there's this tremendous complexity of messiness in the work of leading and learning in general. I would say that leaders, the other thing that they should do, which I try to be very cognizant of, in addition to my why, is representing the very complex work we do as simplistically as you can. It's more likely to stick. If we make something as complicated as teaching and learning, but we present it simplistically, you can't go wrong. And to get clear about going back to the why, getting clear about your purpose and aligning everything you do to it. If you cannot see a direct link between that why and that child you're thinking of and that simplistic representation of what you do, there isn't a clear link to everything else, then you should stop doing it because it isn't adding the value that we all came into this intending to accomplish. Overly simplistic representation, I know, but that's it. I think that's what it takes to lead and to lead well.
Masterclass with Dr. David Cintron. Thank you so much. I would like to ask you to give us one last closing, signature closing. And if you don't mind, can you give us your best? Let's get this reading party started.
Okay, absolutely. Let's get this reading party started.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cintron. Thank you so much. David, thank you for sharing your insight, your leadership, your heart, and your joy with us today. Your perspective reminds all of us that lasting literacy change happens when policy, practice, and people are truly aligned. And that starts with leadership. To our listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of Amira's Champion Every Voice podcast. Keep supporting educators, keep leading with heart, and keep giving every child a chance to become a reader. Until next time,